They said the sovereign eclipse was untouchable. A flagship forged from obsidian steel and ambition, commanded by the fiercest queen the stars had ever known. She led with fire in her blood and iron in her voice, feared by her enemies and worshipped by her own. Queen Zelura, the unbreakable, the unconquered, the embodiment of power itself. But legends don't fall from the sky. Until they do. The ambush came without warning. One moment, she sat on her throne of command, eyes scanning the edge of the galaxy. The next, fire tore through her ship's hull, and everything she knew, her legacy, her empire, her body shattered in a heartbeat. She survived the crash. Broken, paralyzed, betrayed. Trapped on an uncharted world with no army, no power, and no one left to serve her. No one, except him. Hayden. A human slave she once ordered into silence. A man she had stripped of freedom and name. Now the only living soul beside her. And the only one who refused to leave her behind. This is not a story of revenge. It is not about warships or battlefields. It is about something rarer. Something far more dangerous. It is about what happens when the powerful fall and the forgotten rise. It is about two enemies stranded in the silence of survival and the unthinkable choice they must make between who they were, and who they might become. Because sometimes, the greatest revolutions begin not with a weapon but with mercy. The sovereign eclipse was not just a flagship, it was a symbol. A leviathan of war forged from the strongest alloys mined in the fire moons of the Draconian Empire, equipped with weaponry that could erase cities from orbit, and helmed by the most feared commander in 12 star systems, Queen Zelura. For a generation, her name had meant conquest, her voice had called armies to their knees, and her presence on the battlefield had been enough to break enemy lines before a single shot was fired. And yet, even legends can bleed. The ambush came not with the loud defiance of war, but with the quiet calculation of betrayal. One moment, Zelura sat in her command chair, surveying the stars like a predator scanning her territory. The next, the sovereign eclipse trembled violently, as enemy fire tore through its hull with surgical precision. The ship groaned, her systems spasming in confusion, as if the vessel itself couldn't believe what was happening. "Where is the fire coming from?" she demanded, her voice calm but edged with steel. Her tactical officer fumbled with controls. "3 warships, no signatures. They're using cloaking fields from our own design-modified versions." Zelura's eyes narrowed. Her empire didn't give away its secrets. These ships weren't stolen. They were commissioned. Then it hit her. This wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't sabotage. This was something far worse. It was family. Even before the confirmation came through the fractured comms, she knew. Only someone with inner circle clearance could have orchestrated this. The weapons, the timing, the tactics, all of it pointed inward. And there was only one being within her bloodline with both the ambition and the ruthlessness to strike like this, her sister, Vexar. The thought cut deeper than any weapon. She had known Vexar was restless, ambitious, jealous, even. But to move against her this way, to break the sacred oath of blood and empire, it was unthinkable. Unforgivable. And yet, here it was, unfolding in real time, with deadly precision. Another explosion rocked the ship, knocking her from her throne. Lights flickered. Smoke filled the bridge. Alarms screamed in every direction, as if the universe itself was mourning what was about to be lost. "Your Majesty," her first officer called out, dragging her to her feet. But she wasn't listening. Her mind was already racing. She activated her personal comms. Evacuate the ship. All hands to escape pods. This is not a drill. But the order came too late. A direct hit tore through the rear of the vessel, fracturing the energy core and sending a shock wave through the command deck. The bridge exploded in fire and metal. Zilura was thrown like a doll, her armored body colliding with the support beam behind her. She felt, not heard, her spine break. The world tilted, blurred, dimmed. For a long moment, everything was silence. Then came the pain. It was sharp, immediate, and all-consuming. She tried to move, but nothing responded. Her legs, the limbs that had carried her across battlefields soaked in blood and glory, were now dead weight. She was paralyzed. And her empire had just been handed to a traitor. Time warped. She drifted in and out of consciousness as the remnants of the ship screamed through the atmosphere of a nearby planet, its hull melting from the heat of re-entry. Impact came like thunder cracking open the sky. She didn't feel it, not really. She was already too far gone, in mind, in body, in heart. When she awoke, hours, maybe days, had passed. She was pinned beneath the collapsed bulkhead, barely able to breathe, her body broken and burning with pain. The world outside the wreckage was strange: violet skies, jagged terrain, crystal-tinted vegetation that swayed in an alien wind. But stranger still, was the sound of footsteps. Soft, cautious, human. She turned her head, barely, and saw him. A man. Dirty, bruised, wearing the tattered uniform of a slave engineer. His name was Hayden. She remembered him, the defiant one. The human who had dared to speak back when brought before her tribunal. The one whose inventions had cost her 3 warships before he was captured and sentenced to serve beneath her decks. And now, against all odds, he stood before her. Not gloating. Not running. But kneeling down, checking her pulse, clearing debris, stabilizing her breathing. She wanted to scream at him. Command him. Kill him, even. But all she could do, was stare. Why? She whispered, her voice hoarse and laced with rage. Why save me? He looked at her, not as a queen, not as a tyrant, but as a person. Because I'm not like you, he said. And with that, the great Queen Zilura, conqueror of 12 star systems, realized something far more terrifying than death. She owed her life to a man she had caged. The ambush hadn't just destroyed her ship or her body. It had shattered her identity. And now, stranded on an alien world with no allies, no throne, and no working limbs, the queen who had never bowed to anyone would be forced to depend on the one soul in the galaxy she had once declared beneath her. That, she thought grimly, was the true price of betrayal. Not death, but humiliation. And perhaps, if the stars allowed it, redemption. It was never supposed to be him. Of all the lives aboard the Sovereign Eclipse, elite soldiers, master tacticians, hand-selected royal staff, it was never supposed to be the human slave left standing when the dust settled. And yet, when Zilura opened her eyes again, drifting in and out of consciousness beneath the twisted wreckage of her shattered command deck, it was his face she saw. Framed in smoke. Blood on his brow. Hands shaking as they worked to clear the debris trapping her body. At first, she thought it a hallucination, a trick of her fading mind. But then came the pain, sharp, real, visceral, as he shifted a beam from her chest. Her breathing caught in a half snarl, half sob. You're alive, he said, not as a report, but as a quiet observation. She blinked hard, her vision narrowing to the pale blue eyes that had once stared at her in defiance during his trial. The court had labeled him a dangerous insurgent. She had seen a clever nuisance, too valuable to execute, too proud to break completely. And so she had sentenced him to servitude in her engine rooms, hoping the weight of the empire would wear down the edge in him. But it hadn't. 3 years in chains, and he still looked at her as though she bled the same color as him. "What are you doing here?" she managed to rasp, her voice dry, her throat raw. He hesitated. "Saving your life, apparently." She wanted to strike him. Curse him. Remind him of his place. But the truth wrapped around her like the broken metal pinning her legs. There was no one else. Her officers were dead. Her crew gone. The escape pods she had ordered deployed now floated somewhere beyond the stars. She was alone. Except for him. "You should run," she spat. "They'll come looking. For me. For survivors." "I know," he said simply, as he cut away at her flight harness. "But you're not dead. And I don't leave people behind." The irony cut sharper than any blade. A draconian queen, conqueror, enslaver, tyrant, now reliant on the mercy of a man she had once stripped of everything. Pride, freedom, even his name. She remembered his file now. Hayden Ward. Former resistance engineer. One of the brightest minds in human defense technology. Before she claimed him. "You think this makes us even," she said bitterly as he looped a piece of torn fabric around her arm to slow the bleeding. "That saving me erases what I've done to your people." He looked at her then, really looked, not with hatred, but something colder. "No," he said. "But it means I'm still human." The silence that followed was heavy, not because of words left unspoken, but because for the first time in her life, Zillara didn't know what to say. She had faced assassins, warlords, revolutionaries, and crushed them all. But this quiet man kneeling beside her, defying every law of power and vengeance, unarmed and unafraid, he unraveled something in her she hadn't known existed. He worked with methodical focus, treating her wounds, securing her limbs, fashioning a crude stretcher from shattered armor plates and insulation tubing. She watched him in silence, the pain becoming background noise to the far louder ache in her chest, an ache she couldn't name. Every breath tasted of ash and humility. As he lifted her onto the stretcher, her hands brushed against his arm. His skin was rough, calloused, marked with old burns from the engine core. Scars she had caused. Yet those same hands now held her as though she mattered. "You don't have to do this," she said, not as a threat this time, but a whisper. A flicker of vulnerability escaping before she could pull it back. He paused, glancing down at her with something like pity. Or maybe it was understanding. "I know. That's why it matters." For hours, he pulled her across the valley, over uneven terrain, through crystalline brush that sliced at his arms, under skies that threatened acid rain. He never once stopped to rest. Never once let her slip. She didn't thank him. She couldn't. Not because she lacked the words, but because something inside her refused to allow it, the same part of her that still clung to the illusion of superiority, even while broken. But she watched. And remembered. There were moments she thought he might abandon her. When the winds picked up and the air grew thin. When strange shadows moved in the trees. When he cried out from a fall, blood dripping from a gash on his palm. But each time, he got back up. Silently. Without complaint. Without cruelty. He built their first shelter out of the wreckage of a drop pod, patching holes with emergency tarps, insulating the floor with fragments of melted wiring. He propped her up, gave her water, applied healing gel from the medkit. He didn't ask for instructions. He just acted. Not as a soldier. Not as a servant. But as a man who refused to let anyone, even a former tyrant, die alone. That night, under a canopy of stars she didn't recognize, Ziluro lay awake, listening to his breath just beyond the curve of the shelter wall. He had given her the insulated bedroll and taken the cold ground. A choice she would have punished a soldier for. But now it made her chest ache in a way the broken bones didn't. She had always believed power came from fear. From dominance. From control. But this man, this human, had no control. No armor. No title. And still, he held all the power. Because while her world burned, while her empire betrayed her, while her own body betrayed her, he chose to stay. Not because he had to, but because it was right. And that, Zilura realized in the silence, was the most terrifying kind of strength of all. The planet did not want them. From the moment their broken ship split the sky and fell into its violet forests, it was clear this world had no mercy. The days were dry and blistering. The nights dropped to near freezing. Strange crystalline growths shimmered in hues that looked beautiful from afar but sliced skin on contact. And the creatures that lurked just beyond the tree line, silent, many-eyed, and always watching, made sure Hayden never put down his makeshift weapon. Hayden had faced hardship before. He'd survived the mining colonies of Mars and the front lines of Earth's resistance, but this was different. He was no longer a soldier, no longer a fugitive. He was the last of his kind on an alien world, dragging behind him the shattered body of a queen who once would have ordered his death without blinking. Zilura had been silent for much of the journey. Pain dulled her voice. Pride kept her questions at bay. But her eyes remained sharp, alert, and always on him. Watching. Judging. Measuring what kind of man he truly was now that she was powerless. Hayden didn't speak much either. Words felt heavy in the thick air, and besides, there was too much to do. He scouted during the early mornings, searching for signs of water or salvageable tech from the wreckage. He built makeshift structures from broken hull panels, stacked rocks to anchor the tent against windstorms, dug trenches around their camp to deter predators that hunted at night. Every movement was methodical, practiced, efficient. But even efficiency couldn't keep death away forever. The first predator came on the third night. It moved like smoke, silent and fast, its translucent skin revealing pulsing veins and bones beneath. Hayden had just finished boiling water through a cracked purifier when he saw its eyes, 6 of them, glow faintly in the darkness. It lunged before he could scream. Zilura, weak and feverish, still found her voice. Behind you. It was enough. Hayden turned, diving sideways as the beast struck. He rolled, grabbed the charged spear he had rigged from conduit wires and battery packs, and jabbed upward as the thing pounced again. Sparks flew. The beast shrieked, retreating into the trees with a wound sizzling on its flank. Breathing hard, Hayden slumped against the rock wall, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His heart thundered in his chest. He expected silence, maybe even contempt from Zilura. But instead, her voice came low and steady. You fight well. Even without training. He looked at her, surprised. I had training. You just never asked. She didn't reply, but her gaze lingered longer than usual, and something unreadable passed through it. Not approval. Not admiration. Something quieter. Perhaps the first sliver of understanding. Over the next few days, something changed. Not all at once, not dramatically. There were no declarations, no grand reconciliations. Just small shifts in rhythm, in gesture, in silence. Zilura began offering suggestions as he worked, pointing out weaknesses in the shelter's structure, suggesting elevation strategies to protect against ground crawlers. Hayden didn't argue. He listened. Implemented. Adjusted. She noticed. When Hayden returned one afternoon with bruised ribs after a scavenging mission, Zilura insisted on helping dress the wound. Her hands, though trembling, moved with precision. She had once commanded legions. Now, she steadied strips of cloth against his skin. "You could have left me behind," she said quietly, not looking at him. "You still can." Hayden shook his head. "Not how I'm built." She studied his face, searching for mockery, for weakness, for any crack in his resolve. She found none. That night, the cold was harsher than before. Hayden built a fire using dried vines and fuel gel from the crash, but the wind was relentless. The shelter rattled. Frost crept across the metal floor. Zilura was shivering by morning. Hayden didn't ask for permission. He simply lay down beside her, carefully avoiding the worst of her injuries. Their bodies aligned out of necessity, shoulder to hip, back to chest. Her scales radiated a dry warmth, like sun-baked stone. She tensed at first but said nothing. Eventually, she relaxed. This was survival. Nothing more. And yet, in the silence between their breathing, something unspoken began to take root. In the days that followed, they spoke more. Not about politics. Not about war. But about places. Memories. Earth, with its wild oceans and concrete cities. Draconis Prime, with its skybridges and floating temples. She told him about her father, a ruler who taught her strength through solitude. He told her about his sister, who once smuggled medical supplies into resistance camps before vanishing without a trace. He confessed his fear of being forgotten, of dying on a planet that would never know his name. Zilura didn't comfort him. But she didn't dismiss him either. "You won't die here," she said once. "Not if I can help it." And somehow, from her, that meant more than any promise. There were moments they still clashed. She hated his improvisation. He hated her stubbornness. She refused to rest when in pain. He refused to follow her outdated protocols. But amidst the friction, they began to fall into rhythm. She would wake before him, tracking sunrise angles through cracks in the shelter. He would bring water, filtered through moss and purifier, warm it slightly, and help her drink. She taught him how to read movement in the treetops, signs of stalking predators. He taught her to listen for ground vibration, signs of stormquakes. Together, they began to map a world that wanted them dead. Together, they began to survive. And survival has a way of erasing titles. She was no longer just Queen Zilura of the Draconian Empire. He was no longer just Hayden Ward, resistance prisoner. They were two souls clinging to life on a forgotten world, with no one but each other to hold onto. And somewhere between stitching wounds and sharing rations, somewhere between frostbitten fingers and firelight whispers, something inside both of them began to thaw. They didn't speak of it. Not yet. But it was there. Growing. Waiting. The first time she moved her foot, it was barely perceptible, a flicker of muscle, a twitch beneath torn fabric and crude bandaging. But to Hayden, it was the signal flare of a new beginning. "You moved," he said, crouching beside her, breath catching. Zelara didn't respond right away. She stared down at her leg, lips parted, as if she herself wasn't sure it had happened. For days, she'd felt nothing from the waist down. The crash had left her spine damaged in ways even draconian biology struggled to recover from. But now, there it was, motion. Fragile. Small. Inarguable. She looked up, her silver eyes meeting his. "I felt it," she said quietly. And in that quiet, there was something unfamiliar. Not victory. Not command. Hope. Hayden didn't smile, but he did place a hand gently on her knee, grounding her. "It's working. The treatment's working." She nodded, then turned her head away as if embarrassed by her own relief. Her recovery wasn't quick. Nothing about it was. The healing came in phases, slow, uneven, frustrating. Pain returned before motion, and when it did, it came sharp and cruel, dragging groans from her throat she hated herself for making. But each day, there was more. More sensation. More control. More vulnerability. Hayden adjusted her treatment as her body progressed. The medicinal plants he'd gathered in the weeks following the crash, gelid blue leaves with anti-inflammatory properties, were crushed and layered along her spine. He built a brace from scavenged armor, wrapping it with thermal mesh to help her sit upright without collapsing. When she could finally hold her torso without aid, she demanded to walk. "You're not ready," he warned, adjusting a support beam inside their upgraded shelter. "I am not broken," she said through gritted teeth. "No," he replied, turning to her, "you're healing. Which means doing it right." Zelara wasn't used to being told no. Especially not by a human. But something in Hayden's voice wasn't defiant, it was protective. Not as a subordinate, not as a man correcting his queen, but as someone who cared whether she fell again. That distinction confused her. She had lived most of her life behind layers of discipline, armor, and expectation. Draconian royalty did not show pain. Did not ask for help. And certainly did not need the comfort of someone who had once worn chains in their service. And yet, every day, Hayden treated her with a kind of dignity that ignored the hierarchy between them. He spoke to her, not around her, not down to her. He listened. He gave her choices, even when the answer felt obvious. When she failed to lift her legs during therapy drills, he didn't mask the disappointment. But he didn't shame her, either. He simply adapted. Tried again. At first, she resented the way her pride buckled beneath his patience. But over time, she came to understand, this wasn't weakness. This was resilience shaped by mercy, not dominance. Strength that wasn't afraid to wait. The mornings became rituals. Hayden helped her from the bedroll and guided her through stretches. She would grip his arms, her claws occasionally digging into his skin when pain flared. He never flinched. They worked in silence, breathing in unison, muscles trembling beneath shared effort. At night, when the cold returned with teeth, she no longer hesitated when he slid in beside her beneath the woven thermal wrap. The warmth between them was no longer necessity. It was comfort. A word she had never allowed herself to need. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the valley, Zelara sat upright against the shelter wall, her back braced, her legs stretched before her. "I used to believe that pain was weakness," she said suddenly, her voice low. Hayden looked up from the circuitry he'd been modifying into a primitive beacon. "It's not," he asked. "It's vulnerability," she corrected. and I was raised to believe that vulnerability kills. Hayden said nothing for a while. Then he replied, softly, sometimes it does. But most of the time, it's what keeps us alive. She turned to him, studying his face in the flickering blue light. The way he said it, so plainly, so without bitterness, it struck her deeper than any argument. I thought I knew what strength was, she admitted. Victory. Command. Fear. You were half right, Hayden said, putting down his tools. Strength is surviving what should have killed you. And still choosing not to become the thing that broke you. Zillara stared at him, at the man who had every right to despise her. Who had been forced into silence, into labor, into obedience. Who could have left her to die and no one would have blamed him. But he hadn't. He stayed. He healed her. He challenged her not as an enemy, but as someone who believed she could be better than who she had been. That night, as he helped her lie down, his hands gentle beneath her shoulders, her fingers brushed against his wrist and lingered. Not command. Not request. Just connection. Thank you, she said, barely above a whisper. He met her gaze. For what? For not treating me like what I used to be. He nodded once, and for the first time, she thought she saw something shift in him. Not forgiveness, exactly. But peace. The healing was no longer just physical. It was trust born from shared suffering. It was pride reshaped into something softer, something more human. It was two broken lives, slowly stitching each other back together, not out of obligation, but out of quiet, stubborn hope. And for the first time in her reign, Queen Zillara understood what it meant to be strong enough to let someone in. The nights were the most dangerous. Not because of predators, though they stalked the perimeter, drawn by movement and the scent of blood, but because the silence was too complete. There were no alarms, no orders, no crowds to command. Just breath, wind, and the unspoken weight of everything left unsaid. And in that silence, the line between enemy and companion began to blur. Hayden had learned how to read her moods by then. The way her eyes narrowed slightly when the pain returned. The subtle twitch in her fingers when frustration overtook her pride. The rare, almost imperceptible shift in her jawline when something he said struck a nerve. He never pushed. But he was always present. Zillara, once queen of a ruthless empire, found herself looking at this man more than she intended to. At first it was calculation, trying to assess his motives, his loyalty, whether he'd eventually turn resentment into revenge. But over time, the glances became something else. Curiosity. Then recognition. He didn't carry himself like a broken man. Not anymore. At night, they often lay side by side in the shelter. Their proximity was born of necessity, heat conservation, space limitations, but something deeper lingered in the closeness. His body, though human, radiated a steady, grounded warmth. Her scales, usually a barrier between her and the world, seemed to react to it, softening under the heat, relaxing as though remembering something ancient, something safe. There was one night when the wind howled louder than usual, a dust storm ripping through the valley, shaking the walls of their shelter. The small energy cell they had used to power a protective field had finally drained, and the shield no longer hummed between them and whatever watched from the trees. Zillara's hands gripped the edge of the bedroll, her claws twitching, not from pain but something more primal. The vulnerability of knowing she couldn't rise. Couldn't fight. Couldn't protect herself. Hayden, seeing the tension, moved closer, not to offer comfort, but presence. He didn't speak. He just lay beside her, chest rising and falling in calm rhythm, letting the steadiness of his breathing replace the storm's chaos. After a long moment, her voice broke the dark. "Were you ever afraid?" she asked. Her tone was quieter than he'd ever heard it. Hayden turned his head slightly toward her. "Every day, for the first year in your engine room. Not of the work. Of forgetting who I was." She didn't reply at once. The question that came next felt hesitant, unfamiliar in her mouth. "And now?" He met her gaze, their eyes inches apart. "Now I'm afraid of remembering who you were." The honesty struck her like a blow. Not because it was cruel, but because it wasn't. It was vulnerable, raw in a way few had ever dared speak to her. Yet it wasn't an accusation. It was a confession, one he trusted her enough to share. Zilora didn't apologize. That wasn't in her nature. But she shifted slightly, not away, but toward him, letting her arm brush against his. The contact was deliberate, tentative, and entirely unroyal. Hayden didn't move. From that night onward, something changed. They began to share more than survival strategies. Stories emerged in fragments. Hayden spoke of Earth sunsets, of climbing trees as a boy, of music played on old radios during wartime. Zilora listened with a quiet hunger she didn't understand. In return, she spoke of her mother, long buried beneath the sands of Draconis Prime, of rituals by moonlight, and the song of blades during royal ceremonies. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. And yet, in the flickering firelight, they found pieces of each other in the stories. Loss. Loneliness. Loyalty. Longing. They were not so alien after all. One afternoon, as Hayden changed the dressing on her shoulder wound, his fingers brushed the edge of her collarbone. Her skin scales or not shivered under his touch. She glanced at him, eyes searching. He looked back but said nothing, only worked more carefully, more gently. Later, when he helped her sit up and placed his hand on the small of her back for support, she didn't pull away. She leaned into it, almost unconsciously. And when she caught herself doing it, she didn't apologize. The silence between them had grown rich not with tension, but with understanding. There was another night, days later, when the storm had finally passed, and the sky was clear enough to see the moons. They lay on their backs beside each other, the shelter open to the stars. The air was still cool, but bearable. Hayden pointed upward, tracing constellations he'd invented as a child. "See that one?" he said. "That's where I used to pretend the resistance would hide behind that crooked line of stars." Zilora followed his gaze, amused. "You think we wouldn't have found you there?" "You didn't find me here," he replied, and she laughed, a low, melodic sound he'd never heard from her before. It startled them both. "I don't remember the last time I laughed," she admitted. "Me either." They didn't kiss that night. But something in them did. The next morning, when Hayden helped her stand using the brace and support stick, her hand slipped around his wrist more easily. When she stumbled, he caught her without hesitation. And when she rested against his chest, catching her breath, neither of them moved for a long time. In that closeness, in that small moment suspended between past and future, there was no queen. No slave. No war. No title. Only two people, bruised by the same sky, learning how to breathe together. It wasn't love yet. But it was something just as rare. Safety. Not from the world outside, but from the silence inside themselves. And for the first time in their shared exile, neither of them felt alone. The data crystal was no larger than a fingernail, jagged on one edge from the crash. Hayden had found it embedded in the security panel of what was left of the bridge, half buried beneath scorched plating and fractured circuitry. At first, he wasn't sure it had survived the impact. But when he slipped it into the makeshift reader he'd scavenged together from the wreckage, the console flickered to life. And what it showed would change everything. He stared at the screen, brows furrowed, chest tight with disbelief. Footage unspooled silently, a high-level encryption sequence used to bypass draconian defense networks. He recognized the military signature immediately. But it wasn't from rebels or outside forces. It wasn't alien tech or stolen codes. It was worse. It was an official override. Internal. Registered to a genetic key from the royal line. Zealara's line. He sat in silence for several minutes, letting the truth settle in his bones like cold iron. Then, slowly, he rose from his workbench and crossed the clearing back to the shelter where Zealara rested, her back against the wall, eyes half closed, her face pale but steady in the afternoon light. She looked up when he entered. "You found something," she said. It wasn't a question. Hayden didn't speak right away. He held the device out to her. She took it carefully, slipping it into the small interface patch on her arm brace. The screen lit with the same footage. As she watched, her breath caught. For a moment, her face remained unreadable still, poised, regal as always. But then her jaw clenched. The screen faded to black. The silence between them swelled. "It was her," she whispered. Hayden didn't have to ask who. Her voice carried the name, even without saying it. Vexar. Zealara turned her gaze to the floor. Her fingers curled into the bedding. "I should have seen it. The signs were there. She's always questioned the way I ruled. Always wanted more. I thought it was envy. Or youthful rebellion." "She used your bloodline code," Hayden said. "The ships that attacked you, they were built under her command. Funded with royal credits. Not a rebellion. A coup." Zealara exhaled slowly. Her scales, usually a cool gradient of indigo and silver, began to shimmer darker, a storm rising beneath her skin. "I gave her everything," she said. "I raised her after our mother died. Trained her at my side. She sat in on my councils, stood with me in the war chambers. And still, she turned on me." Hayden watched her carefully. He could see it happening, the war within her. Rage, guilt, sorrow, betrayal, all twisting through her like lightning across a battlefield. She wasn't just a queen processing a failed assassination attempt. She was a sister who had loved deeply. And been broken by it. "Empires don't fall because of enemies," she said after a long moment. "They rot from within. From ambition dressed as loyalty. From family who forget what the bloodline was built for." "You're not responsible for her choice," Hayden said gently. Her eyes snapped to him, fierce and bright. "Aren't I?" He said nothing. He let her speak. "I raised her on command and conquest. I told her fear was more effective than love. I taught her how to win but never how to lead. I never showed her how to rule with grace. Only how to take what she wanted." The admission sat between them like a blade. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Hayden stepped closer, kneeling beside her. "Maybe that's why we're here," he said. "Not just to survive, but to change what comes next." She looked at him, then truly looked, and for the first time in all the weeks since the crash, he saw something flicker in her eyes that went deeper than anger, deeper than pain, regret, and something else. Something fragile and terrifying. Resolve. She'll consolidate power quickly, Zelora said. She has access to my private advisors. She'll feed the court a narrative that I died in the ambush. That I led us into a trap. That her rule is the only way forward. Hayden nodded. And if you show up alive, she'll call it treason. She'll say I was compromised. Or worse, manipulated by a human. She'll brand me unfit to rule. He met her gaze, steady. Then we don't give her that chance. A long silence passed. Zelora reached for the pistol at her side, the one they'd salvaged weeks ago, still charged with a final energy cell. She placed it in his hand. When the time comes, she said quietly, if I can't stand, if she wins dash. He cut her off, fingers closing over the weapon. We fight until there's nothing left to fight with. Zelora's lips parted, as if to argue, but she stopped herself. Instead, she nodded. Later that night, as the stars returned and the wind fell quiet, they sat beside one another, not touching, not speaking. Just breathing. I always thought I would die on the battlefield, she murmured. With a blade in hand. My name etched into the bones of the Empire. Hayden looked up at the stars. Maybe you still will, he said softly. But maybe your name will mean something more. She turned to him, and for a heartbeat, they were no longer queen and captive, warrior and survivor. Just two people, scarred by the same betrayal, clinging to the same fragile hope. Zelora reached out then, not as royalty, but as a sister who had lost her own. Her hand closed around his, scales brushing skin. I won't let her win, she said. Not just for the throne, but for what it could be. Hayden didn't reply. He simply held on tighter. In the distance, somewhere beyond the trees, a ship's engine rumbled. They were no longer alone. And the war that had begun in silence, was about to begin again, this time with fire. The ship sat in a clearing bathed in silver light, its sleek design foreign to the wilderness around it, as though it had been dropped from a future that no longer existed. The scout vessel was small, built for speed and stealth, not for rescue. Its systems were functional, barely. Its signal capacity was limited. But it could fly. It could carry someone off this forgotten world. And that was enough. Hayden stood at the ramp, looking back toward the edge of the forest where Zelora stood supported by the brace he had constructed for her. The wind tugged at her cloak. Her face was calm, but the stillness in her shoulders betrayed the storm behind her eyes. He knew what she was going to say before she said it. He could feel it in the space between them, heavy and inevitable. You have to go, she said quietly. He shook his head. No. We go together. That was the plan. The plan changed the moment that ship landed, she replied. We don't have time to wait for a miracle. One of us has to return. One of us has to be the witness. You're the queen, he said. They'll listen to you. They have to. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I am the queen they believe dead. The one my sister has already replaced. If I show up at the palace now, wounded, unsupported, with you at my side, do you think they'll fall in line? No. They'll call it treason. They'll call me compromised. I don't care what they call it, he said, his voice hardening. You deserve to take back what was stolen from you. But I can't do it alone, she said. And I can't do it from a prison cell. She stepped forward, her movements slow but deliberate, every inch of her defiance carved into the way she stood. You can. You're human. You're the last thing they expect. You're not just a survivor, you're the spark. Hayden looked down, fists clenched at his sides. Everything in him screamed against this. For weeks, they had fought side by side. Slept side by side. He had watched her rediscover her strength. She had watched him reclaim his identity. They had pulled each other from the edge. Now she was asking him to leave her there. You think they'll listen to me? He asked, voice quiet. I think, she said, stepping closer, that you carry something even I never did. Conviction without conquest. You don't want to rule. That's why you're the only one who should. He turned to her, eyes sharp with pain. What happens to you? I'll stay, she said. Regroup. Rally those still loyal. Build from the shadows. If you can get the message through, if you can make them see the truth, we can split their forces. Divide their faith. That's how we win. You'll be alone, he said. Zela's expression softened. I was alone long before this planet. The only difference now is, I know what it means to be seen. She reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled out a medallion, the royal insignia she had worn since the day she ascended the throne. She pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers around it. This proves my claim, she said. It also proves yours. He stared at it, feeling the weight of something far greater than metal. This was never supposed to happen, he said, not looking up. No, she agreed. But maybe it had to. The silence between them thickened with everything they hadn't said. The nights spent holding back what they didn't dare speak. The touches that lingered too long. The moments where silence meant more than words. Now there were no walls left to hide behind. He stepped closer, raising a hand to her face. Her eyes closed as his fingers brushed her jaw. I don't want to leave you, he whispered. And I don't want to lose you, she replied. But if we both stay here, this ends with us. Vexar wins. The cycle continues. No one learns. His forehead rested against hers. They stood like that for a long time, breathing each other in, memorizing every line, every warmth, every ache of what could not be kept. When I reach them, he said, when I stand in that palace and tell them who you are, what you've done, what we've become, what if they don't believe me? They will, she said. Because you'll make them believe. Not with a weapon. With the truth. He pulled her into him, arms wrapping around her like armor. She melted into the embrace, letting her head rest against his shoulder. When we win, he said, voice steadier now, when this is over dash. When this is over, she said, you come back for me. Or I come for you. He stepped away before he could change his mind. Walked toward the ship. At the ramp, he turned back one last time. Zela stood tall, framed by the fractured forest, the moonlight gilding her in silver and shadow. He didn't wave. Didn't speak. He just looked. So did she. And then the ramp closed. The ship rose, a low hum filling the night, breaking the silence that had been theirs for so long. She watched it disappear into the clouds, hands still clenched over the empty space where the medallion had hung. She was alone again. But she was not the same woman who had fallen from the sky. She was no longer the queen who ruled by fear. She was the one who had chosen hope. She was the one who had let love walk away. Because it was the only way to bring justice home. And far above her, flying toward the stars, the man she had once enslaved now carried not just her symbol, but her future. The capital of the Draconian Empire had not changed. The great marble towers still spiraled toward the red heavens. The banners still bore the imperial crest. Soldiers still patrolled the gilded walkways with cold precision, and citizens still lowered their eyes in the presence of power. But Hayden had changed. He stepped through the gates of the palace not as a prisoner, not as a fugitive, not as someone pleading for mercy or revenge. He walked with his shoulders squared, his pace deliberate, carrying a truth heavier than any weapon. At his chest, hanging on a strip of torn flight fabric, gleamed the insignia of Queen Zelura, the one they all believed dead. No one stopped him at first. He moved like someone who belonged, and in the Empire, sometimes that illusion was enough to pass unnoticed. He bypassed guards, slipped through servant corridors, descended into the hidden parts of the palace he had once mapped during his time as an enslaved engineer. The air there was cooler, quieter, but no less tense. Even without seeing her, he could feel Vexar's rule. It radiated from the marble like frost from stone, imposing, beautiful, but empty. He found them in the old war chamber, former officers, council members, and mid-tier nobles, huddled in hushed conversation around flickering hollow screens. Faces that once commanded fleets now bore caution and weariness. Power had grown brittle here. Fear had taken root where loyalty once lived. One of them looked up as he entered. A sharp intake of breath followed. "A human," the man spat. "How did you get past security?" Hayden stepped forward, unbothered. "Because you weren't looking for me. You were looking for ghosts." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the insignia. He held it up in the flickering light. "Zelura lives?" Gasps. Silence. Disbelief tangled with denial. A councilwoman stepped forward, her face pale. "That's impossible," she whispered. "We saw the wreckage. Her ship was destroyed. Her escape pod never launched." "She didn't escape," Hayden said. "She survived." He told them everything. The ambush. The crash. The truth hidden in encrypted logs. The name of the traitor that orchestrated it all, Vexar, not a rival from beyond the borders, but from within the bloodline. He told them how he had found Zelura broken and near death, how she had clawed her way back to life not through privilege or power, but through pain, grit, and the unbearable cost of seeing the world through the eyes of the forgotten. He told them what she had become. Not the queen they remembered, but the one they never expected. Some didn't believe him. That was inevitable. But others listened. And in the quiet afterward, a single voice spoke. "What does she want?" Hayden's answer came without hesitation. "Change. Not just a return to power. A rebuilding of what was broken, an end to the system that made people like me disposable, and people like her unreachable. She doesn't want to rule through fear anymore. She wants to lead through truth." The words stirred the air like a storm on the edge of a battlefield. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, an older general leaned forward. "And you? What do you want?" Hayden took a breath. He could feel the weight of everything behind him: Zelura's strength, the scars of slavery, the quiet moments in the shelter when power meant nothing and humanity meant everything. "I want to see a world where no one has to earn their worth through blood," he said. "I want to be able to stand in this room and not be seen as a symbol of rebellion or guilt, but of what happens when people choose to change." There was silence again. But it wasn't rejection this time. It was consideration. In the days that followed, whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into meetings. and meetings turned into something dangerous hope. Hayden moved through the palace like a shadow, connecting the disillusioned, planting seeds of doubt in a regime that had grown complacent in its lies. Vexar noticed. She tightened her grip. Deployed elite guards. Silenced dissenters. Publicly declared Hayden a traitor and a manipulator, an alien voice corrupting the memory of her sister. But the more she shouted, the more the cracks showed. Because Hayden wasn't just speaking. He was showing. He walked among soldiers, fixed broken systems in engineering bays, healed wounded citizens in back alleys with salvaged medkits. He looked people in the eye. He listened. And for the first time in a long time, the people of the Empire saw someone who didn't want power, only justice. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't grand. But it was real. One morning, word reached him in the underground: the mission had succeeded. Zelira had been retrieved by a loyalist faction, her location secure. Her injuries had not worsened. Her strength was returning. She had sent only 3 words in response to his report. "You were right." Hayden closed his eyes when he read them. Not from pride, but from something deeper. Relief. Gratitude. And the beginning of something he had never truly allowed himself to feel. Belonging. When Zelira returned, it was not on a throne carried by soldiers. It was not in armor, or fire, or spectacle. It was through a back corridor, flanked by those who had once doubted her, and now followed not out of fear but choice. She stood before the council, pale but unbroken, eyes steady. "This empire is not mine," she said. "It belongs to those who believe it can be better. And the first step is this: the one who carried my truth, who fought not with weapons but with honor, he will not stand beneath me. He will stand beside me." Hayden stepped forward. There were no cheers. Just a long silence. Then one person clapped. Then another. And another. Until the chamber rang with the sound of something greater than applause. It rang with the sound of change. Zelira turned to him, her voice low enough that only he could hear it. "You were never just a slave," she said. "You were always the spark." And as the Empire began to write a new chapter, one forged not in conquest, but in conviction, the people looked not to the stars, but to each other. Because the greatest revolutions don't always begin with fire. Sometimes, they begin with mercy. And the courage of one man who chose to stay, and then dared to rise. History has a way of condensing the truth. It polishes memory until only the boldest strokes remain, the names, the battles, the treaties signed beneath banners and flags. But what it often forgets, what it fails to immortalize, is the silence before the roar. The quiet decisions that shift the world, not with explosions, but with whispers. Not with blood, but with mercy. This is one of those stories. Not because it was written in fire, though there was fire. Not because it birthed a rebellion, though it did. But because it began in a place so small, so broken, that no one expected it to matter. It began with a crash. A queen, shattered. A slave, forgotten. A world, unmarked on any map. And the simple, stubborn act of a man who chose not to walk away. What followed wasn't immediate triumph. It was survival, inch by inch. It was bruised hands and fractured bones. It was pain, hunger, fear. And it was 2 people who had every reason to hate each other learning instead how to listen. Zelira had been raised to lead through dominance. Her name had once carried the weight of 12 star systems. Her decisions had ended wars, leveled cities, enslaved entire populations. And yet, in the belly of a crashed ship, surrounded by silence and wilderness, she became something far more rare than a ruler. She became accountable. That shift didn't happen in one day. It unfolded in fragments. In the way she began to trust Hayden's judgment. In how she allowed herself to ask, not command. In the slow, painful acknowledgement that perhaps the system she fought to reclaim was no longer worthy of her protection. And Hayden, he had not wanted to be a hero. He never sought redemption, not for himself, not for others. He had been a builder, an engineer, a survivor who had seen the worst of what empire could do. His life had been reduced to labor and silence. Yet when given the chance to abandon, to run, to let the queen who had imprisoned him die beneath metal and flame, he didn't. Not because he forgave, but because he remembered who he was before they tried to break him. And that's what made him powerful. Not strength of arms, but strength of spirit. Not the ability to destroy, but the refusal to become the thing that tried to destroy him. It was that refusal, that quiet conviction, that reshaped the course of an entire civilization. When Zillara stood again, truly stood, not just with braced limbs but with clarity in her spine, it was because Hayden had reminded her that leadership without empathy was only tyranny in disguise. And when Hayden returned to the Empire's heart, carrying not vengeance but vision, it was Zilara's name he defended. Not the name she had once ruled by, but the one she had earned in exile. Together, they dismantled the idea that power had to be inherited, that titles meant purpose, that blood alone dictated who deserved to speak. Together, they asked something ancient and dangerous. What if we chose differently? And that's why this story endures. Not because of its spectacle, though it had that. Not because of its politics, though they shifted. But because of the human truths it refused to ignore. That strength is not the absence of weakness, but the choice to rise through it. That healing is not a destination, but a commitment made daily, sometimes hourly. That transformation requires not just courage but humility. And that sometimes, the greatest act of defiance is tenderness. The empire they rebuilt did not erase the past. It did not pretend the chains never existed or the scars weren't real. Instead, it learned to wear them differently. To remember. To teach. To build systems that guarded against silence, against apathy, against the return of the old shadows. And at its center were not a queen and her consort, but two survivors who had chosen each other. Not because they were perfect, but because they knew what it meant to be broken. And still worthy. Years later, when new rulers would rise and new banners would be flown, their names would still echo in the chambers where policy was forged and futures decided. Not as myth, but as precedent. As proof that two people once divided by bloodlines, war, and walls could find a new path. Students would read their letters. Soldiers would study their tactics. But artists, poets, and dreamers would tell the real story, the one not bound by military records or royal decrees. They would tell of how a queen fell and stood again. Of how a slave became a voice that shook the stars. Of how love grew in the shadow of ruin. And how the smallest axe, a wound bandaged, a story shared, a hand held in the dark, built something no empire had ever dared imagine. A future built not on control, but on connection. A legacy not of conquest, but of compassion. So if you ask why this story is remembered, why it is spoken across planets and etched into stone, it is not because of what they changed. It is because of how they changed. Together. And in doing so, they gave the galaxy something rarer than victory. They gave it hope.